Hello everyone, today we talk about Assyrian infantry and infantry tactics indeed. So we go back once again, some of the earliest part of the timeline I usually cover with my channel, and I must confess I rediscovered the Assyrians a bit in recent times. I don't know that much about Assyrian history, honestly. No, I'm that better compared relatively to their military history, but it's a pretty amazing chapter into military history, and you have to think the Assyrians had the most advanced armies of their times. They had a pretty complex military organization, and in spite of the embarrassing lack of evidence that we have from, let's say, conventional sources, we still have a pretty good amount, especially of iconographical evidence for the time standards, which is still obviously very few, very scanty, but it's enough to let us say certain things, especially about their infantry, because Assyrian armies were basically all about infantry. So what we're gonna talk about today is, by talking about the Assyrian infantry, to look a bit at the broader picture. The Assyrians at a point start using in consistent numbers cavalry. The Assyrians at this time were we're mostly going to look at the army of the say from the from at least relatively to infantry now, perhaps from the 9th to the 8th or 7th century BC. So we're in a time into which only chariot warfare has already declined. Assyrians did have chariots as well. But let's say that aside from these cavalry units, the really bulk, main force of the Assyrian army was made up by by infantrymen, and a certain variety of them. We'll try to explain also why this was the case. As always, you have to look at their politics and especially their society. So we're talking about Mesopotamia. It was the core land of this sedentary, this fertile crescent that, just like other river basins around the world, had allowed enough surplus to maintain large bodies of infantrymen to, and not just that, but generally speaking, from a social point of view, to have also a stratified society. So to build up certain political systems that could work, let's say, with a certain degree of hierarchical order and organization and direction from the top. We're talking also about city-states. Assyrian warfare, and the Assyrian military, generally speaking, was generally, especially at the beginning, something conceived essentially for storming enemy cities. At least that was the greatest feat that at that time, in a Mesopotamian context, you could do, because yeah, sure, like, you know, at all times, the easiest, most common thing to do is devastating the countryside, pillaging and destroying the cultivations and all. But the main goal was to take those cities so you could control the surrounding countryside, and these cities were in fact difficult to take. Once you had taken, though, you could keep them for a long time. Obviously this is a bit of an approximation, because then political upheavals and I mean, a lot could happen, but the Assyrian military was a bit shaped in this fashion. So relatively to the infantry organization, what we can say, well, the Assyrians had a pretty well-organized army. The army was divided into corps. They were distinguished. This is important because we're talking about armies proper. Those were not bands of people gathering together just to raid or pillage, like it had been kind of the average up to that point in most of the known world. These guys, similarly to other civilizations, by the way, so it's not just the Assyrians, but start to distinct pretty uniformly in some fashion. Several corps in the army. We can't talk about uniforms or standard weapons, but generally speaking, a certain homogeneity was given in organization terms. We know this because we know that part of the equipment was not just issued and provided by the single peasants, the single conscripts, but that there was enough surplus, enough statal control to provide weaponry and armor to certain troops. Obviously, the minority of them. This is say normality in pre-industrial times, but it's still very meaningful that there was this kind of statal organization. The Assyrian Empire was something pretty big, also extensionally speaking. So you have to think of this as part of a broader organization that comprehended these territories. Obviously, there was a core and a periphery. The Assyrians also largely ruled through client states of various types. They could be either cities or tribes, but they ruled pretty much with iron fist over a pretty large area. And by the way, you have to think also at their culture and their we are in a time in history in which there are not many, say, humanistic feelings. Let's put it in this way. Even if you look at Assyrian religion, it was a pretty dark conception of I can't say a dark conception of existence, but definitely was pretty harsh. It was a very violent world. The right of the conqueror was to do basically whatever he wanted to the vanquished. And the Assyrians definitely destroyed, devastated lots of populations. Think about Jerusalem that had been destroyed by the Assyrians. Relatively to the numbers, today I wouldn't like to talk about this because now I just stated something about organization because just to give a broader outlook of the situation, but there will be other things to tell, including how large were actually Assyrian armies, and we have this. From the few historical sources we get numbers like of hundreds of thousands of men. Obviously they weren't. At best they had some tens of thousands. But you have to figure these numbers in those times. I mean, we were still in a relatively very primitive age. We don't have to be tricked by what these guys have left us in terms of big constructions and all. But there is a bit this tendency in today's world to say that the ancient world was something overly complex from socially speaking, but it really wasn't. These guys normally built big things because that was a way to make them last. It all corresponded to this, even partly to the poverty, material poverty of their own world. I mean, if you build a city wall, for us, if you look at these archaeological finds, we look at these very ancient ruins, we say, well, okay, that was just a city wall. But for them, it was really something. It was built in stone, for instance. It was meant to last for geological ages, from what their understanding of the world could be. They had all a series. I mean, even the fact that someone could build a city at that time was something amazing. So it all corresponded to the glorification of the local ruler. And it was definitely very difficult to storm even a place like that, and that's why the Assyrians were so effective in their times, because they had a military organization that allowed them to get past that problem, and that was a pretty big show, military might. So yeah, so what was really the Assyrian military about? I mean, what was the spearhead of the Assyrian army? Well, it was infantry, as was said, and infantry meant as kind of a shock troop. chiefly you have to think at this time there is also another big problem, that is the problem of discipline and of training. As we've said, there was a certain degree of centralization that could provide that in some form, but at the same time, even though we are in an age into which, in fact, chariot warfare has kind of declined exactly because of the strengthening of infantry formations, we don't have to think at an extremely disciplined army. A lot of emphasis was put actually on the assault, on hand-to-hand combat. It was still a pretty individualistic way of conceiving. I mean, it was all about mass at this point, especially for such big armies that could provide large numbers. But it was still a world into which it was the impetus, the charge, that really made the difference, not the strict, perfect, coordinated movements, the perfect order, like it would come later, let's say in Macedonian or Roman times. There was still this big deal of relative disorganization in the sense that all it took was obviously to have a rank, to have lines of battle, but that could keep cohesion, but it was mostly about their whole mass and really the single discipline of the individual. That, however, is still very important because a certain degree of collective cohesion can be achieved only through a minimum of training. Most of the troops that the Assyrians fielded were usually pretty unruly troops for the best of the Assyrian units, let's say. Were also lots of auxiliaries at the time, recruited from other populations that sometimes were even tribal. So you can imagine even the relative dishomogeneity that existed into these. But the important thing was really the shock effect, really. And we're talking about Spearman. The Spearman is historically the universal fighter. The spear has certain intrinsic advantages even over the swords most of the times, and that's what you want to have in battle. A relatively thickly packed formation of spearmen. We will see that weren't just these actually in the Assyrian army. But let's say this kind of infantry, of melee infantry, is necessary for everything. It's a property of the infantry as an arm to for instance, to seize certain areas either on the battlefield or to launch an assault to fortified cities. That, as we have said, was the main concern of the Assyrians. You need melee infantry. And part of these infantry, definitely an elite, was protected by, we can consider for Assyrian standards, an heavy infantry. Not just for Assyrian standards, in truth. There was wearing long coats, long coats of mail, and we have this even iconic picture of the Assyrians for the few evidence we have from an iconographical point of view. What we find here in the background picture, these pointy conical helmets. With a metal hood attached. So, however, what if I drink a little before we pass to the archers, that are what really are maybe mostly interesting in the Assyrian army. This might be surprising in part, and it's still, let's say, I still haven't properly, still feel I haven't properly myself understood the nature of Syrian warfare under a certain point of view, but I've kind of shaped my own idea in mind, which I'm gonna give you now. By the way, I want to tell you that there is definitely a lot of speculation relatively to how these armies worked. In which sense? Well, in the sense that we have, as we were saying, a few historical evidence. So in historical terms, we work in this way. If you don't have a source that states something or that shows something, you can't speculate, and that might be a good theory, but a good speculation, let's say better, but a good hypothesis. This is what I want to say, but it's not. You can't really prove it. When you study military history, however, you can do something more, usually, that is applying a sort of military logics to the understanding of how even these relatively less known armies actually worked, because sometimes historically we get this different informations that can derive chiefly from the nature of the source in itself. That is, every people has, in certain phases in history, tells, first of all, its own story in different ways. And for us, historically speaking, it's very easy to kind of make a stereotype and saying, oh well, yeah, that's that people fought in that way and that people fought in the other way, and we like to stress the differences, the characteristics, the characteristic features. But as a matter of fact, we know that we are still human beings. Doesn't matter which time in history. At this point, we're talking about 3,000 years ago, but 3,000 years ago we were exactly the same as today from a genetic point of view. So we're the same humans. And humans, especially before the development of certain technology, always fought essentially in the same way. And in great part, war is still being fought in the same way it's always been fought. I mean, there are certain essentials that never change. And they're not those things you find into memes. I'm really talking about how the nature of warfare in itself, and how certain dynamics work, also in terms of mass, of morale, and all. So we can feel part of the gaps we have in our historical knowledge by applying this military logic. So when we see something, when a source tells us something, we can speculate with a fair amount of certainty relatively to what it could be, that we don't know, that is not shown in there, but that has some value, because we know that most armies in history did that thing. For instance, also in terms of military organization, of actual, for instance, the size of the actual units, we know that there were some units whose dimension in history as roughly, and whose function in that sense as well, from a tactical point of view, has always been the same. Because humans work in that fashion, in groups, always in the same way. So sometimes we can articulate an explanation, a broader explanation, especially revolving around such assumptions that are just assumptions from a historical point of view, but kind of makes sense in part. So what is fascinating about the Assyrian army, and here you find even the kind of the pair here, was archery. The great importance was given to bowmen. Now, first of all, why is this? We can say that the main power of the Assyrian army was made up of archers, by the archers, and we're talking about, they were a pretty standard unit to find in every Assyrian army. There was a big deal of them. In numerical terms, were used in every tactical situation practically. They used composite bows, were rather powerful. They then the kind of archer could vary, as we will see, especially in equipment, which tells us, by the way, that there was this even a sort of tactical segmentation of the various kinds of units, and for a wider range, actually with a more varied range for the archers than for the spearmen. So it tells you that these Assyrian archers were very flexible. They could be really used into many situations, even in part as melee troops, like the guys with heavy armor, these archers were also occasionally equipped with swords, and also as we will see now, even what varied tactical employment they could have. So why this very large amount, also numerical amount of archers? Sometimes archers were even more than infantry. Well, I think it makes sense from a certain point of view because of the lack of armor. It might sound a stupid, mechanicistic answer, but I think it's not that far from the truth. We're talking about a rather poor world, as we were saying before. Yes, and you have to think that the Assyrians were among the wealthiest peoples around there, because as we've said, by living in the fertile crescents, they had a big deal of surplus that it could be. It was still very poor, though. I mean, the crop rates weren't much greater than other times in history at all. So it was still a sort of survival economy, and the few surplus you could get was enough probably to field such armies and even to keep them decently. But we can think the largest amount of fighters, including the enemies of the Assyrians, were largely naked. They didn't wear armor. So having a bow, that is a pretty amazing thing, pretty amazing weapon, one of the most ancient in the world. We don't know whether the bow predates the spear or the sling. We don't really know. It was definitely present from prehistory, very ancient times. And for this very reason, that if you don't have something that stops an arrow, there's a very few things you can do. There are many organic materials that can be used for stopping an armor. There are even bone or horn armor, but they costed a lot for those time standards as well. And I mean, talking prehistorical times, what I mean is that if you don't have an armor, a metal armor, well, fencing off these composite bows, arrows, was pretty difficult to do. There were shields, naturally. We will see that were extensively used, made of wicker, so not really maybe the best material you may think of, but still effective in some measure. But therefore, having lots of archers could mean that you could take out a wide amount of people, since there were no armor. So even the fact that the Assyrians are usually represented with mail coats and other lamellar armor actually suggests that the Assyrians had the best technology to defend themselves from arrow shots. And we will see that there was also a pretty big deal in the same Assyrian army for fencing off enemy arrows, because definitely also our peoples used bows, and we're also in fight between the same Assyrians at some points. So it's kind of natural and interesting, because like many times in history, the best armies of the world had one major I mean, the greatest foe they had was really another army of their own. So usually again during civil wars, so they had to be ready to react to that as well. So we don't have to think at a sharp division between Assyrian warfare and one of other peoples. There were lots of intersections that also passed through within the same people. So weaponry and warfare develops on such basis as well. So the early Assyrian archers, we already find them wearing mail coats at some point, in some measure, in some numbers, as we think they were definitely the elite, have this amazing feature, these amazing characteristics that appears also in later times, as we will see, that every archer was actually paired with a shield bearer. At this early age, we have a round shield, a small round shield, like a buckler, essentially, that in the sculptures we find basically being put in front of the archer's face. Then in front it's pretty... we are obviously... That's the point. It couldn't happen because if you have a shield in front of the face, you can't you can't aim properly. But the idea that we find also later is that these shield bearers had to protect the archers while they were shooting, which is kind of a weird thing, and it got me curious a little because there is actual evidence also in other times in history of missile troops who were accompanied by shield bearers, or that maybe solve the situation by having a large shield on their own. But I had never found actually such depictions of, you know, an archer that is shooting and another guy with a buckler over his head is trying to fence off his you know, the arrows that are thrown at him evenly. So I don't think that this... I mean, I would have liked how this really worked, and nobody knows, unfortunately, but it sounds pretty clumsy to do. I don't know what you think. I mean, wouldn't it have been better to have, at that point, just to quicken up the whole thing, also in organizational terms, to just have an ordered file of arrows and to archers and shooting maybe just more effectively without guys in the middle that were shielding them with these bucklers? By the way, are not very large shields either. So what were you defending substantially? If they were wearing, if these archers were wearing a coat of mail and a helmet, well, they weren't immune to arrows, but at least that's still overall probably better than a guy with a buckler in front of your face. Definitely, yeah, the face was exposed, and a shot in the face could really. It's really a nasty thing, let's say, that can knock the guy out. So probably these were also partly certain elite units of archers that maybe were defended in such a fashion, but I still find very weird this kind of you know, guys sticking to the archer and covering his face with a buckler. And what we see later, we will see now with larger shields that were also used even as a sort of palisade. It kind of makes more sense than that, because it's what you find extensively also in the Middle Ages, for instance. But this thing of the small buckler, I don't know. But since we got these pictures and we have to interpret them in that way, we have still to make our minds work around what we have and the evidence that we have. So the relatively to the equipment of these troops, both the infantry and archers, we have to think that the average would have consisted in a tunic, in some belts for carrying out swords and daggers, knives, or even the other tools sometimes that could be used to definitely the archers, I think, had quivers, and there is an extensive evidence of that. But let's say there was probably also some degree of recognition attached to that, because some units seem to have worn particularly elaborately embroidered tunics, and they might have been elites, and this is interesting because they were usually lighter archers. So one could speculate whether this were maybe more a certain kind of specialized troops that maybe worked with some sort of hit and run tactics, being lighter, and maybe be more precious for some reason, or maybe it was a cultural stuff, and maybe there were the youngers who wanted, as usual, to demonstrate their military prowess, and maybe they were the sons of the nobility or something like that. They wanted to do that with these archers. By the way, what is interesting about this never really happened in the West, because in the West, and so this has to be understood, because sometimes we reason as Westerners when we talk about Eastern. The Assyrians weren't all that Eastern thing. I mean, well, sure, but maybe some of them in origins were even Indo-European, not just Semitic. But what is important in a larger perspective, when you think about Eastern armies, Asian armies usually, is that in the West, in Europe, we've always used, I mean, the bow was a poor weapon. It never reached, I mean, the arrow never reached this, I mean, the bow never reached this great meaning attached. I mean, in the West it was all about the sword and the spear. In Europe, in the East you find, even in Japanese military culture, in China, you know, this idea that the bow is actually even a noble weapon in many ways. Yeah, I know in Europe there is some evidence of that too, especially in the very ancient times, but that's what I mean. That's an exception. So even thinking about an elite troop of light archers that normally we would mechanically associate to spare troops, essentially, to get and kill pretty easily, actually in those words might have also equated to a sort of, maybe, but it was a noble elite who wanted to show, and just speculating really, relatively to that. First, saying that the bow actually was a great symbol, such a great symbol that it actually figured on the royal Assyrian battle standards that were carried by the royal guard during the battles. The Assyrians had this solar symbol. It had essentially copied the sun, probably from the Egyptians, and they attached to it an archer. So that gives you the dimension of how important archery was for them and what a big deal it was. So we shouldn't be surprised to see this great specialization into archer units and all. And I think there is evidence that some of these archers actually did the same thing that the standard bearers did with one another. What shield bearers did with the other archers. That is, essentially kind of passing from working in pairs always, and protecting each other with a shield. I think it might have been in turn. First I go, then you go, and that's it. And that might be a hint, in my opinion, but it's just my opinion, so it can be perfectly wrong, as most of my opinions. That those might have been actually younger noblemen doing a sort of an initiation to warfare. But the majority of archers were definitely standardly used as archers doing this not extremely dynamic thing, if not in pair with these shield bearers that, however, seem to have essentially had not an extremely dynamic relation with these archers, especially the ones with bucklers. I mean, telling you the truth, these shield bearers surely engaged the enemy as long as it could reach the archers. So this is pretty obvious. We see that also from other evidence. But the idea is that if you have infantrymen, the archer might be also in first lines, but they're not the best you can use into melee. I mean, it's better to send spearmen in. So usually the archer is someone who is operating from the posterior lines in some measure, and that. But the fact that Assyrian archers were so widespread in the army I think is an explanation for these shield bearers that you find attached at every moment to the archers, like in this picture actually, because the probably I don't know whether to explain it now or not, but there are many. I mean, in terms of military logics, at least the few I can understand, uh, the idea is that if you have an army, you want to distinguish the tactical functions of the various lines. Yes, you have lines of troops, mixed lines of troops, mixed with very different weaponry, including these shield bearers and archers. Shield bearers could be also spearmen or swordsmen in this sense, not just simple butlers of the archers. But and that's it. I mean, the idea of an extremely fluid combat made with these pairs going back and forth to the I don't know what, so in a very flexible fashion, is partly possible. But probably it wasn't really what the main pitched battles were about, I believe. I mean, I imagine the Assyrian armies as these lines of troops. Chiefly, it was a line of spearmen, usually of two people deep, essentially, and then certain troops at the on the flanks, kind of lighter troops, often auxiliaries, kind of protecting the flanks, and then other lines of either of infantrymen or archers behind that. Sometimes, at least in the most complex deployments. Otherwise, the lines there could be even a single line. But in this sense, it's difficult to find in that scenario the functional reason for this pairs of archers and shield bearers, unless these archers didn't go very close to the enemy themselves, and which might have sense really if you consider that probably most of the enemies also use similar tactics of bow, let's say with missile weapons, because even the impact probably of the melee, as you know, in military history is pretty. It's not rare, definitely, because it's what most battles are made of, but it's something that lasts very few. And most of the battle is, melee usually lasts a couple of minutes, literally, because humans are not made to fight for a longer time, even the best trained ones. And then there is you distance with the enemy, and at that point you keep you keep skirmishing all the time. So at this point, this individualistic attitude of archers kind of can kick in. So you have this individual archer with a shield bearer that kind of exposes himself, even if with some act of bravery that probably was praised in this sense for archers, as we were suggesting before, to harass the enemy in the meanwhile. So these moments of these pairs, these single pairs, could probably work pretty much individually, as well as probably as a single line. So there was this kind of flexibility into that if you wanted to, especially I think, put archers in the very first line, so in a situation where they were exposed, first of all you needed certain troops to guard them. So these shield bearers equipped with certain melee weapon, as actually the same archers at some point talking about weapons, could really help that. But it was preferable if two lines of spearmen were fighting, definitely, is that there was a pretty cohesive line of archers posteriorly to these spearmen lines that also for the sake of effectiveness could have an homogeneous fire, so not really working as these single monads made of pairs, but also working as a formation. And we will see later, in fact, that especially it seems in later times the Assyrians kind of developed certain more complex archery units, even on multiple lines, that kind of began to exclude partly, in fact, in that situation, this shield bearers in front of them. Even though in the iconographical evidence we always see more or less mixed troops, and we can't properly understand whether it's just an artistical license or if these battle lines were actually made up like that. I personally tend towards the idea that this omnipresent figure of the shield bearer attached to the archer is a bit of a can say a cliche that the Assyrians were, but it was more of a symbolic thing to say, even for some cultural reason. But I don't think that tendentially at least, I don't think that archers stayed with these shield bearers all the time in front of them. Although it was possible to see that, especially when the situation got pretty difficult, or where the terrain was uneven, and therefore formations kind of lost their unity, that the best way to defend these archers was to attach a spearman to them. But who knows? I would like to ask to certain experts relatively to this, because it doesn't fully sound right, and I don't find actually any other evidence in history of a single, let's say, of large body of archers, at least, that were protected singularly by shield bearers, unless that they weren't in a more solid formation. Like if you plant a very large shield in front of you, you keep that, especially even with a lance. Maybe you have an archer behind you. Well, that makes sense. That has a sense, and we see that the Assyrians did that. But the individual pair out of the formation is something that doesn't make an excessive sense, after all. And anyway, this is how I think hypothetical the whole thing really is. So as I was saying before, the Assyrian army also had a great deal of auxiliaries in their ranks, and they were usually lighter. This is normal. You know, the Assyrians were the best military around. They had best equipment of average, and the rest of the auxiliaries came from even more primitive societies, and they were less armored. Although, and they seem that they have neither have in certain cases nor armor nor shield at all, being armed either with clubs or even with slings, or at least in the early times. But this is, I repeat, when I say in the early times in here, it's just I'm just basing myself on the evidence we have. That doesn't tell it all. I mean, it doesn't make sense even to conceive this progression, because, I repeat, certain troops fighting the same way, conceptually speaking. It's not about just the society transforming. What you have on the field can be, I mean, for instance, these clubmen or slingers are something you find in every ancient army, in some measure. So it depends where you take them from. It depends where you want to deploy them or not, what you make them do. Usually what they do is to basically gravitate around the heavier troops and to offer them support in this sense by going these ones back and forth along the line, especially the slingers and our skirmishers. Clubmen usually are something pretty good for actually for hand-to-hand combat, especially against armored opponents, because the club has this traumatic impact. It can can cause internal traumas, so it's pretty effective. And it seems that the the function of such lighter troops was in this sense not just skirmishing, because probably you consider that if you have such a large amount of archers by standard, maybe you don't really need these guys to be all about skirmishing, because you already have a pretty solid firepower already. So the sling is definitely an effective weapon as well. We don't find much of javelins in this iconography as much as I've seen among these auxiliaries, but probably they surely had as well. But in this sense, also consider the arrow factor was probably all around. You have to think, I think, Assyrian warfare to have the skies constantly crossed by bolts. So probably these auxiliaries were best fit for some kind of other sneakier thing to do. That is probably surrounding the enemies. That, as we've seen on average, weren't probably that much heavier in terms of equipment to these same auxiliaries, or even to launch series of assaults, maybe into the gaps formed into the enemy formation. And you have to think about these auxiliaries being also, there was nothing formal about their being auxiliaries, but probably also some certain mortiers or brigands attached to these main armies that were following them just for the sake of loot, which is pretty normal in these times. You have to think such an expedition of an army, of an Assyrian army at the time. First of all, it was a big event, and that's something you didn't find around in the rest of the world, if not in Egypt. I mean, in these advanced civilizations, I mean, having such a big army that goes into an enemy land to pillage, it's the best occasion for every mortier of the region to join, and like to ravage. To ravage the countryside like a locust, and so they would be there also in combat probably to exploit, like to pillage the enemy camp as soon as possible. There have always been these kind of troops around into ancient armies, and not only those. So around the second half of the 8th century BC, we started see the appearance of the so-called Garen shield. That is, I think, the one you see here. That is this kind of shield. This is actually, it looks actually heavier, in some heavier material. These Garen shields were usually made up of wicker, as we were saying before. Sometimes were provided with a hood, so to offer extra protection, and these shields were started being used also by the shield bearers. So from the bucklers we find this passage to this other form of shield. This also is a kind of a mechanical explanation. Probably didn't happen like that. There had probably always been other types of shields, larger shields compared to the buckler that were used. But the introduction of this Garen seems to have probably corresponded, in my opinion, to greater specialization of the Assyrian army, because the idea, first of all, is the Garen is more cumbersome, definitely, to carry and all, but it also means probably that it's being conceived for a more specific use. That we'll see what it is. I mean, if you have a heavier weapon like that, first of all, the first thing comes into our mind is it was conceived for a more static fighting, or at least a less dynamic one. And we have extensive evidence now. We'll see how they were used, especially during sieges. So they were used as sort of fixed protections, even placed on the ground. For the archers to shoot from. Yet it was still something used individually in those pairs that could move quickly, so it was made of wicker, it wasn't made of iron. The dimensions suggest this thing. And one of the other consequences of this was that the archers kind of grew less less armored. At least there is evidence that some of them were kind of specializing towards the a lighter equipment because the Garen was there to protect them. So this is pretty clever because the Garen surely costed less than a coat of mail. So you have a broader, in economical terms, from terms of the military administration, you saved a lot of money, and plus you had a more effective thing to use. But that happened not because one genius woke up one day and invented that. It happened probably because the kind of tactical theaters were kind of changing, or at least it was the chance to specialize the Assyrian army in a fashion that this kind of unit could be used more effectively, especially during sieges, as we were saying before. So it corresponds actually to an improvement of Assyrian tactics, whereas the guy with the buckler looks at something much more precarious and proper, or a more primitive fighting. And it is probably more dynamic. I mean, it's not really inferior fighting. Primitive doesn't mean inferior. But, I mean, primitive in the sense that it was a much more a material thing. The Garen pertains to a better organized world, and a more organized warfare. So the Assyrian infantry usually, whether they were archers or melee troops, they were usually had a sword, often, which is also interesting because swords were costly, were expensive. So it's not a it's very interesting about the material wealth of at least what the Assyrian military could afford from the management of the empire for its armed forces. So and the sword was kind of was an assault weapon. We think of certain units of swordsmen who had certain specific assault tasks, and also think of fighting into narrow passages, into breaches, into the spear can hamper you in some measure. So the sword is really maybe more fitting into that situation. For siege, say urban warfare in part. Not that the spear was useless, but there would be certain situations into which you might have wanted to, I don't know, if you had to climb walls or you have to fight over the walls eventually. A sword's kind of faster. It's kind of more agile as a weapon. So how did really the infantry work instead in open ground, or at least outside of the city walls of siege warfare? Well, we have certain reliefs that actually show the spearmen, Assyrian spearmen marching in double file. While another actually shows infantry advance through a forested area. Think how Mesopotamia could be at the time. There are forests into Mesopotamia as well. We're talking about wooded areas, like probably nothing extremely thick, but still not maybe the best ground for an ordered formation. But this is still interesting because what is showed by these reliefs is that the spearmen are lying abreast in separate ranks, and there are many other small scattered forces that follow them, either on the flanks or in the rear. So this is the concept probably that there were some enemies that surely took refuge into wooded areas because they knew that the relatively disciplined Assyrian army, in that sense, in such terrain, would lose its cohesion that was so effective even in open ground. So the idea of marching to these wooded terrains, like to sweep out all these areas. So these very long lines of spearmen had to really pass. It's like when you go hunting, by the way. Also the Indians did something like that when it went chasing tigers or stuff like that, because that's how you want to cover a whole area without risk of getting ambushed, at least in this sense, because you're hunting for humans that can perform such tactics, and so you have to think of all these bush people in a certain sense that preferred kind of more guerrilla fighting style, and as all the disciplined armies of say ordered organized army, that was sometimes fighting this guerrilla was something pretty difficult to do, even for their standards. So that was a good way to sweep entire areas by making this line advancing through the wooded ground, and clearing the whole area. And it's interesting that there are these other small units floating around that can intervene where maybe the fight has started and maybe the line is under pressure, and you need reinforcements in there, and also these troops on the flanks that want to avoid you getting surrounded. So this is also a theoretical thing, because you can't sweep entire forests. Sometimes you simply don't have the numbers. So, but in that case, probably it would have been foolish even to venture into there without proper other plan to solve the situation, or because that's always what it's been. Guerrilla warfare has always been very difficult to cope with, and if not with other guerrilla troops, and surely the Assyrians had enough auxiliaries to carry that out without having to engage the best of their units into this attrition, into this meat grinder that would have been anti-economical, definitely. By the end of the 8th century, we start seeing an increasing segmentation of archery units. Chiefly, we see that there were lighter archers as well. So this probably suggests us, relatively to what we have just said, that especially with the expansion of the Assyrian Empire, the Assyrian military required an increasingly amount of lighter troops to deal with this hit-and-run tactics and all. And that's why also cavalry starts to kick in larger numbers, and what, generally speaking, the Assyrian armies start to get more flexible. Even in terms of military equipment, you find certain boots, for instance, that were particularly suited to uneven terrain, especially in Asia Minor, where the Assyrians ventured, and similarly the Assyrians in there took those boots from the local populations that were pretty skilled mountaineers. So there is this kind of this is normal, because one thing is to fight into Mesopotamia, into these city-states, warfare into flat ground, and so with relatively heavy troops, because the cities had the surplus and could better armor their units, and on a flat ground. So all the emphasis is put a little bit like in the Greek city-states, with this heavy infantry that clash frontally and all. One thing is when you expand and your military evolves from something seasonal to actually to professional. and you need these troops that have to carry out multiple tasks and have always to be there for a longer time. So it's normal that you see this increase in specialization, tactically speaking. So in fact, at this time we start seeing even archers that didn't have nor a shield nor attendants, no shield bearers. So this tells us that probably, in fact, that cooperation with shield bearer and an archer was mostly a less mobile thing, probably than we imagine. Interestingly, these lighter archers are put close in the array relative to the van of battle. So they could be preceded by heavy infantry. So eventually this their usage was mostly either as a reserve or for guarding the camp, which is pretty normal. You know, at all times in history, there are these lighter troops that are left to guard the camp during the battle or even during the march, actually, because the camp moves, and that can meet especially other light troops that are usually the ones who come to surround the main army and to attack the van and the camp. So the Assyrians were responding essentially to certain threats to the threat posed by lighter troops by employing other light troops, which kind of makes sense. And it happens all the time in military history. When you get out of your traditional warfare and you start adopting the tactics of those who were different from you. But also in here, you know, it was something conceptually there also in previous times, naturally in the same Assyrian Mesopotamian warfare. So there is still evidence at this point, obviously, of archers equipped with mail coats and pointed helmets, protected by the attendants. That could be either equipped either in the same way or maybe in a lighter fashion as well. And what we found at this point is that the shield bearer had a lance. So the shield bearer not only gets this larger either round or rectangular shields, but also gets better armed. So this means actually that there is also properly a tactical differentiation in these pairs, in the sense that probably this went from the actual division of the functions, while the original shield bearers with the buckler, I see them with guys jumping around the archer and trying to stop bolts arriving at him. At this point, the shield bearers get less mobile, and they probably form altogether a line of shields behind which the archers shoot altogether. So it's getting a bit more functional, and also in terms of collective effort. Sometimes the archer could be, however, there was a persistence of certain attendants with bucklers as well. And this is interesting because sometimes a single archer could have two shield bearers, one with a Garen and one with a buckler. And the interesting thing about this is that the guy with the buckler, I mean, the archer was behind the guy with or siding the one with the Garen with big shield. So that's evident. That's a defense you want to get behind after you have shot. But the guy with the buckler would stay with the buckler up of his head. So this tells us that there were projectiles arriving from the top. And this is interesting because you can do that with archers. So you know that with a bow you can, you know, every projectile in physics has a parabolical trajectory. But one thing is wanting to shoot straight at the enemy, especially at close range. So that it's as if you know the projectile doesn't curve that much. It kind of gets hit straight on you. One other thing is actually trying to hit the guy, and if he has a shield in front of you, you can't do that. So what you want to do is to throw your arrow in the air and let it fall, exploiting gravity on the guy's head, so getting past behind the shield. So the presence of these guys with a buckler, that at this time they're not waving the buckler in front of the archer's face, but over his head, kind of makes sense. Because that evidently was the response that the Assyrian enemies had found to this increased protection given by the Assyrians to their archers frontally. So this is very interesting, and tells us, as always, that the Assyrian army was increasingly more sophisticated, and also it had more resources, in part. So it's a kind of warfare that is increasingly, it's getting more orderly in some fashion. It's getting more professional. It's getting more. Also, the whole army probably is getting more organized. These what else can we say? Well, yes, that as we were saying, the Assyrians were masters in this type of siege warfare. So this trio of 2 shield bearers and 1 archer seems to have they're usually depicted shooting in front of walls, of city walls. So that was a kind of organization that reflects what I was talking about. It is that these troops were kind of increasingly less mobile. They were just in front of fortified positions, and not just in front of any kind of enemy. So these troops were were stopping there and forming this kind of fence of shields and shooting arrows from behind these shields to harass the city, the enemies that were shooting at them from the city walls, and providing cover for the assaulting troops that had to storm the city, etc. So you see that in any way you put it, however, this Assyrian warfare was dominated by arrow fire. It's very interesting. From the palace of Sargon at Khorsabad, there is this massive source that we have for the reliefs that are there. There are certain carved reliefs they all show battle, mostly show battle at least. There are mercenary archers shooting in front rank. This is also interesting because it shows that where archers were in the first lines, and behind these mercenary archers there are the Assyrian archers, probably instead protected by the shields in the front, and behind them another rank of spearmen with round shields. Behind this, so this is even a quadruple line. Behind this other line, there were seemingly to be archers protected by round shields, held once again by shield bearers. So you have this this multiple formation, this multiple line formation with archers, archers protected by shields, and then spearmen with round shields and other archers behind it. So it's a very, the face of this formation is essentially a depth formation that it's very difficult to approach in the first place, because you have guys shooting arrows from the very first rank, then other archers, then spearmen and archers. So it's mostly about archers, really. Even the spearmen in the third line, it would be interesting to understand how they actually intervened if the archers in the first ranks were attacked. Probably also in here we don't have to take it really literally, in the sense that probably there were gaps or other ways to make also the archers from the first ranks kind of falling back behind the other ranks. This happened in military history, which actually adds up to the degree of training that these troops might have had, because that's something that requires definitely a good collective training, a coordination. So it's not something you can do with say every kind of troops. In fact, in this particular relief, what it seems is that there aren't cheap troops, essentially. What is interesting about the mercenaries, about these foreign troops, is that in fact they were probably professionals in some measure. At least the mercenaries does that for a living, and the other were native Assyrian troops. So these were troops that weren't really to spare. These were probably representing some of the best military combination that could be fielded at that time in terms of tactical segmentation, the quality of the single lines. So there are other reliefs that would be interesting. I couldn't show it now because some of them are difficult even to find, but actually there are also other reliefs to show other dispositions, like spearmen with round shields in the front rank, which kind of makes more sense to my in my mind. So you have guys who essentially protect the whole army with this stop infantry with spearmen. A second line of archers behind them, perfect. And what you see is that this line of bowmen is firing kneeling. On one knee, they're down on one knee, and then there is a second line of archers behind them, so a third line of the whole army that instead are standing, and they're aiming over the heads of the two other lines in the front. This is very interesting because you have that's really a functional formation I can really sympathize with, because it has everything. You have your first spearman in front, it's very functional. Nobody can attack the archers basically without taking out the spearman in the front. So good luck with that. Then you have got two other lines of archers. They are shooting evenly together, because one is kneeling and another is standing. So they have space to fire everything at the same time. And they're obviously firing over the heads of the troops in the front. So this is a very you don't have the advantage of the first formation of the Tiglath-Pileser, because in that you have a line of archers in the front, so they can maximize even the hit in the front, but they're exposed because they don't have any melee troops defending them. At least we've seen that certain archers could definitely be engaged into hand-to-hand combat, but it's not the best thing you may want to do. By the way, those were mercenaries, so probably not the first troops you would have liked to throw away, but we don't really know what the relation that was in there with these troops, who they were, where they were recruited, or maybe there were certain political or cultural reasons for which they had to be in the first line. You don't have to think at tactical dispositions as a purely rational, or at least something that has a pure tactical logics. Maybe these ranks had a sort of honor order, or maybe the king wanted those guys to be in the front because he wanted to get rid of them for some reason. This happens all the time, actually. But this other relief is very interesting because it gives you pretty dynamic, constant fire of two lines of archers fighting at the same time. So trying to maximize the volume of fire at the same time. And relatively to this, we pass to another one, the one depicted for the battle line at the siege of Lachish. At the time of the Assyrian Sennacherib, which we have the maximization of 3 lines of archers firing at the same time. So think about the volume of fire in the air for that. It's very, very heavy. It's a great display of force. So in this representation we have basically the main Assyrian force made up of 3 lines with cavalry in reserve, lots of chariots and horsemen. This is interesting because it also in here it expresses a sort of depth formation with reserves, with very mobile reserves. This is interesting chiefly because also the chariots have still probably a very dynamic use at this point. They're not just the smashers that will essentially transform into the later times, because to trying to compensate the strengthening of infantry that had taken out essentially other chariots from the battlefield. And cavalry too, that is starting to appear in increasing numbers into the Assyrian armies at this time. And what you have is that basically all the 3 ranks are made up of archers. There are just a very few spearmen and slingers interspersed in their ranks. So this is also interesting that there is it's a whole archer army with just a few other spearmen, so of melee, specifically melee troops in dispersed into them. So they don't even make up a line. We will comment on that later. But what's extremely fascinating about this is that all the 3 ranks of archers are firing together. The first rank is kneeling. The first rank is crouching forward, and the third is standing. So basically, these 3 lines of archers are firing at the same time. Now that can really be devastating. It's a firepower that probably up to that time into the ancient world had been unknown. Like as we were saying, the time of chariots was over, but chariots, especially in the early times, began to develop in a very dynamic fashion. They were meant basically to a bit the caracol of the 16th century with the reiter. That is basically these chariots running pretty close to the enemy ranks, shooting their arrows, and then wheeling and going back, and doing it over and over again. So the effect was a very, very thick, heavy arrow fire. It was meant to disrupt the enemy formations. They weren't at the time extremely tough like the ones that started existing from these times. And eventually the same chariots would, together with the infantry, sometimes would attack the enemy and disrupt it. So those were the times of glory of chariots. At this time it's the infantry that has started taking over, and you have this firepower that is maximized by 3 lines of archers. They're fixed, by the way, they are idling, I think, so they're not in movement like the chariot. The chariot in this sense maybe can add even a bit of extra strength to the arrow by running forward and adding force to the arrow when it's shot, but it kind of also loses in precision. Now, precision is not an excessive problem in pitched battles, because all it takes is really roughly shooting at the enemy formation. But we have to think that these 3 lines of archers in the Assyrian army were pretty... They could carry out a pretty concentrated fire, even on certain parts of the formation. They were all standing, firing together, so you add precision, volume of fire, something very, very hard. And probably also the enemies reacted in similar fashion, but as we were saying, the Assyrians were ahead, military organization, so they probably had the best into this and could really make devastating damage to any formation they were meeting. So going back to the spearmen and slingers interspersed in their ranks. So with slingers is fine. We said it before. It was in all ancient and medieval warfare there have been these lighter troops who ran back and forth within the battle ranks of the heavier troops to support them in some way. But what about the spearmen? Because the spearmen here theoretically are wasted in part. What are they doing in there? Well, this is just a relief. We don't really know what the spearmen were doing. If they were perhaps a bit more cohesed, maybe if they were, maybe the third line was made up half of slingers, half of archers and half of spearmen. But we can't really tell. Sure is that the spearman should be it's more effective when he's forming a shield wall with spears sticking out, so kind of stopping the enemy attacks in that fashion. And in such context like the Assyrian warfare, trying even to defend the archers. So this might remember us of the archer's attendant armed with a spear that stayed close to the archer and that protected him individually. So this might be a sort of persistence of that kind of concept. I don't know, frankly. I just find strange that you have a spearman and you use it essentially like what all other armies would have done with light infantry. Just like with the same Assyrians were doing with these slingers that were running around. So I don't know what to say about that. If not that evidently these archers were the bulk really of the Assyrian army. And for the nature of the Assyrian enemies, they were probably the best the Assyrians could deploy. And everything makes sense. Relatively to siege warfare, we have evidence of these Garen shields put all together, side by side, on the ground to form a sort of fence, of palisade. That remembers all the type of protections that existed in sieges in ancient medieval warfare, from which the archers or the crossbowmen shot usually, and so it's perfectly makes sense in many ways. So one advantage of using the shields in that way is that you can form a fence behind which you can also move. You can organize yourself without actually caring about having to keep the formation in order. because the shields are fixed on the ground, so that's it. And it perfectly fits a siege context. Then in the very late times of Syrian history, we start finding some improvement also into some distinction also into infantry. As we were saying before, the Assyrian Empire had overextended in some part. The Assyrians needed not much more, only just these heavy cumbersome armies of heavy troops for those time standards, but also other kind of infantry, lighter ones, chiefly. There was also seemingly an increase in slingers. Slingers were widespread in Egypt at the time, so since the Assyrians were expanding towards that direction as well, I'd say, they probably, there was probably some influence like that. Actually, the sling was surely there all the time, but probably the numbers were increased, which could also mean that, by the way, the Assyrians were starting to cope with other enemies that were a bit different from the ones of the Mesopotamian surroundings, that were a bit better armored, because the slinger is very good at taking out armored guys. So probably, I don't know, some other centers equipped, but telling the truth, this is also a pretty mechanicistic explanation. What is interesting about that is that slingers start also being heavier, equipped with mail coat as well, or lamellar armor and helmets. So these are not just simple troops. They're not just the runaway slingers you can find interposed into the enemy ranks. It's into the running around back and forth within your own ranks. They're actually also pretty elite in their own kind. So there is definitely an attention given to these troops and to the effects that they can make, and that you're not going to spare them. It could be also that slingers were probably better on rather than the kind of enemy that the Assyrians were meeting. It was probably really about the ground, because the sling is very well. It's a very good armor. It's a very good weapon for mountain warfare. Because with the sling, you can exploit gravity to cause a lot of damage, and with a bow you can do that as well. But there is the nuisance of having the arrow actually pointing at the enemy to be effective, because you can be even hit by an arrow, but if it doesn't hit you straight, even from a great height, it's not gonna do you anything. Instead, a slingshot is devastating whichever angle it hits you. From the bow, and so that might be a reason. The fact that these slingers were armored is also interesting, because it means that they were also exposed to other fire. There is much probably about also siege warfare involved probably in this thing, because we can exploit gravity also from city walls, definitely. Probably there were bags or other ways to carry stones. I mean, that's a problem that you should ask slingers for. I mean, it's not very difficult to find stones, although not all of them are effective in the same way for sling throwing. These slingers seem to have participated together with the archers into the collective Assyrian fire, let's say, we have seen to have been so effective, so especially carried out in such grand manner. The slingers were also pretty precise weapons, so it wasn't just about defending cities, but also kind of doing sort of sniper fire, almost, over the enemy ramparts. But it still doesn't explain fully whether archers were not good at that, which I doubt, by the way. So what else can we say? There are so many other details. We should actually look at the various reliefs, because those are more helpful than my poor descriptions, but it kept going on, the fact especially that archers were sometimes getting always increasingly different in typology. Finally, you have certain pictures of at the time of Sargon II of completely bare archers, like without a sword, without anything, like the typical light archer you find everywhere in the ancient world, without this idea that he has to engage into hand-to-hand combat. So it's slow. The Assyrian army is slowly, probably meeting also certain enemies that render their traditional warfare more difficult, or at least certain war theaters that make it difficult environment to really replicate those tactics that had been evidently so effective for building up the Assyrian Empire into the Mesopotamian plain, but that elsewhere weren't that useful. Relatively to other infantry, even Malay infantry, they also used the Garen type. Sometimes even they were also without shield. Others they had certain oval shields of sorts, and we find some infantry unit also equipped with coat of mail to the waist and with a very large metal convex shields. And so usually this type is represented in contained numbers. They rarely see action. They stay kind of in reserve, especially you don't find them thrown into assaults, into the breaches during the siege and all. So some have guessed that these may have been the very elite of the Assyrian army, and known but the same royal guard. So a royal guard that, just to tell you what it could be, a royal guard at the beginning of the first millennium BC, basically a guy with a coat and a large metal shield. So what later would have been still definitely a heavy trooper, but not the very elite in later times. Think about the Hellenistic age and Roman times. So just to remind you how material culture wasn't that extremely wealthy, and that even the royal guards had a relatively modest equipment. The metal shield is interesting because it's a very solid extra defense that you find in the Assyrian warfare compared to the usual weaker shields and just coat of mail and the conic helmet. So that was seen. It's also a pretty expensive thing, telling the truth, for those times standards. Sometimes there were also lighter. There was actually probably lot of type of different light spearmen there. Some of them wore crests over the helmets, and they had lighter armor made up of a chest plate, or even simply some bands around the chest, and certain weaker shields of circular form and all. So this probably was the average fighter you could find in those times, really. Probably peasants, conscripts, also for other peoples who were fighting against the Assyrians. Another thing I found interesting is the equipment of pioneers because their pioneers, usually in military history, are pretty light in equipment. They're nothing but workers usually, and many times in history you find them also recruited from subjugated peoples. So people who were really conceived not as fighters but as simple labor force, and that could carry out this very risky job of building up military engineering under fire, especially during siege warfare and all. Assyrian pioneers appear to have, at least obviously we are always limited in our iconographical evidence, but evidence of Assyrian pioneers being equipped with coat of mail. That is pretty interesting, and using a double-headed axe. This is interesting for two reasons. First of all, the mail coat implies that these pioneers were well defended, because they were regarded as troops, even if you take it just as a poetic license in the reliefs. It's still the idea that the Assyrians praised these pioneers enough to make them wear a coat of mail. Secondly is the weapon they have. It's a double-headed axe. So this can work as a working tool and a weapon. Like many pioneers, actually, it's the case for most pioneers in history. Take the Romans with the Labra, for instance. But what is interesting about it is that think also about the obstacles that could really exist at that time. Yes, we've seen the Mesopotamian world was pretty advanced in terms of infrastructures, of city walls and all, but I think most of even the fortifications here were made up of wood. So having a large axe, if you have also certain physical strength, means that you can't take down those things. I mean, they were probably not very complicated things to do. So you're protected to work in such a fashion under fire, with an armor protecting you, and you're smashing just things in front of you, including people, probably. I don't know, I want to picture them myself in my mind in such a fashion. So okay, and there is other extensive evidence of infantry getting, again, at the time of Ashurbanipal, getting lighter, getting even, especially also the archers, less, increasingly more detached from shield bearers, that seemed to decline eventually, because eventually this thing, as I was saying, didn't appear anymore. When the Persians arrived, I don't remember this thing. I mean, yeah, the Persians did use large shields as well, and a lot of archery, but I don't think this pairs. At least I don't remember it. I could be wrong. But generally speaking, it was another age. It was another phase of war, of the history of warfare, and there was probably much more dynamism that was preferred to this kind of clumsy pairs that had to work together. The more attention was given to the main tactical bodies, and these were preferred to be more flexible, more agile, more specialized. So light archers start being kind of independent on from the shield bearers in Assyrian armies, from what we can grasp at least, or speculate. There is also another interesting thing is that certain spearmen, usually say medium ones, so start carrying, just like in other cultures I can think of, a straight bottom shield, rounded at the top, instead of the old convex oval one. This is also interesting, and I think it's part of the general settling down of the Assyrian army in terms of, I mean, the convex oval shield is something more enveloping, more relatively that you have to use more dynamically in some way, because the oval shape means that it doesn't have to, it can't, you know, if you have a straight bottom shield rounded at the top, so you have basically two corners at the top, and then it's rounded just in the upper part. So what you can understand is the shields are round. Usually they're used pretty dynamically, also in combat. You don't want weapons to get stuck that easily to that. They're more pertinent usually to a more kind of individual combat, especially if they're convex, actually, because if you take the shield walls, the best shield walls actually work with straight shields. The convex shield instead implies something a bit more individualistic, that doesn't really fit the formation. So what you're finding here is that probably the Assyrian army was using these shields that work better in formation rather than in individual fight, and this doesn't really add much to the individual quality of the fighter, because evidently the more the collective quality augments, usually the more the individual quality decreases. So this is the Assyrian world passing from a sort of warrior-like world into a sort of a more civilized one, with more order attached to the formation rather than to more emphasis put on the individual fighter. I don't know if I'm talking well now. I've been talking also for very long, so start getting tired. But this passage means essentially that the shields, these straight bottom shields, were probably also conceived for a more static formation, in some at least a more ordered formation that had to make these shields all stick together, maybe even being posed on the ground, and more than else fighting probably overarm, and therefore the rounded part at the top was meant to make, in fact, the spear being passing over it without so implying that the wall fencing was done upwards in that sense, while with the oval shield it can be a bit everywhere, can be done a bit everywhere. In fact, what you have is that the straight bottom instead is a part that probably only served to protect your lower parts, and not really to make a lot of fence around or even under it. This is the idea, and this is the best for when guys are stuck together and they just use overarm thing. The convex oval type instead is for a more dynamic warrior. Also slingers start to be lighter, or at least more differentiated than the heavy ones that appeared at least in reliefs in the earlier times. So also in here, I think it's as if, this Assyrian warfare is slowly normalizing towards the classical age. At least certain characteristics of the classical age that would have been eventually best expressed by the Persians in some measure. They were a bit the heirs of the Assyrians, at least from a geographical location. They came to rule in the same areas essentially. So what you find all along instead in the Assyrian army we didn't really talk about we've talked about the clubsmen and even the pioneers with the double axe. There were also macemen and other axemen. They were used probably as assault troops, as shock troops, because they had armor but no shield. So also here the concept of the pioneer we have seen. A guy who charges straight at the enemy just to make this shock impact with a blunt weapon. We've seen the axes could be double bladed, like in the case of pioneers, or heralds, a single blade. There were bepennies in this sense, and these troops are kind of normal also in other present also in other close contexts. I can think of India. I can think now just India comes into my mind, but I mean these were probably there all around. The very tough guys with these clubs or blunt weapons would really smash into the enemy lines as a sort of shock elite force. That tells us, what does it tell us? Well, that's perhaps a bit more of the archaic warrior style of warfare, but we don't have to underestimate such troops also into a more complex and sophisticated tactical system, into which you want to throw in these guys at the right moment when a certain part of the enemy line is going to break, or maybe these guys were usually pretty much effective against armored units. So yeah, that's it. And I think this is enough about Assyrian infantry for today. I don't know how many stupid things I said, really, but I think I guess unfortunately we know really this little about Assyrian warfare, so it's mostly conjectures, as you understand. But it's generally the picture of an army. I think especially over time, especially later times in Assyrian history, they're better documented. I think it's pretty clear that there is a transformation of one army from, let's say, a sort of a city-state army to a more professional and versatile army, tactically speaking. I made a video already once about Assyrian infantry, telling the truth, in which I explain exactly this. I was talking about the title is Neo-Syrian Army Sargon's II's Spearman. And basically into this video I comment on how this change basically occurred. So it's as if the early Assyrian army were much more framed into this, even I can say a ritual warfare, but something that mostly had to do with pitched battles, wars between city-states into the Mesopotamian plains, and that in this sense put more emphasis on thickly packed formations, more heavily equipped, and with even these kind of strange cultural and probably social importance attached to archers that remain always important to the Assyrian army, but that sometimes had even a sort of first role into the battlefield. And probably this might have not been the case at the very, very beginning, actually. Probably this passion for archery was developed over times against, especially fighting external enemies. This is the idea I have, because that's probably what was still effective into the into the Mesopotamian context, but that was even more effective against less armored opponents of the surrounding areas. So but what you see is that the more the empire expands, and the more the weight of these units decreases in armor. Say they grow to be less armor, they grow to be more versatile in some fashion, where probably the initial Assyrian army was a bit more cumbersome, a bit more static, and then eventually it gets also thanks to auxiliaries, mercenaries, so external entities. This begins to, because consider also that it happens all the time that when an empire starts to get well off, the people who have fought to gain wealth and riches kind of want to stop fighting. So you necessarily start to think about the Romans. That's how it happened. They started to need foreigners to fight. It's always been the case actually in the Roman context, but instead of probably also in this case of the Assyrians, the bulk of the army at a certain point said, okay, we don't want to go make war anymore. I mean, as long as it was expanding the empire in the surroundings, in this kind of seasonal warfare for which I go fighting for certain months and then I can get home right in time to harvest my crops, I'll go. Then when it gets too long, I don't want to go, and therefore this creates political, social problems, and the armies are increasingly based on people who instead are a bit more desperate, so probably coming from certain even poorer contracts like other tribes at the margins of the civilized world that are either mercenaries or client states, and this also, however, creates a greater dynamism of these troops. Often lighter but more versatile. This is how it happened actually in the passage from classical to Hellenistic warfare, especially for the Greek city-states, and we will see that one day. I think it happened also a bit for the Assyrians. So the major perplexities actually remain, which by the way, however, doesn't mean that the Assyrians that had been left, let's say, in the army, were growing less effective. Probably were growing less individually effective but more collectively effective. But this also augments paradoxically the complexity of the tactics, and that is a problem because the tactics can be very refined, very sophisticated, but it's still, the more they grow, so the more they're more difficult to actually carry them out. So you've seen with the transformation of the shield, for instance, that is typical. It happened many times in military history that you get an initial moment in which you have fewer even troops that have an individual value, that also are even heavily armored, and then you get but that are not capable of extremely complex maneuvers. They just have an individual strength. Then eventually it evolves towards larger bodies of troops that maybe have more imposed discipline and training at a collective level, but that are lighter and have also less cohesion. And they're usually mostly conceived to fight into formation. So I don't know how clear this is, but we will talk about this. We will talk about this for the ancient world again, for the medieval world again, because it happened all the times, and maybe you will understand better what I was talking about. So for now, I hope that you enjoyed this video, and if you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.